Hi. Well, today's the big day. Today we're going to actually get into what it means to 3D model. We're going to do extruding, we're going to add faces to things, we're going to add edges to things. We're going to get crazy with it. So come along with me. I'm Drake. I make things. Welcome to Drake Makes. Now, in the last episode, or in case you already knew, I described how everything in 3D is made of vertices or points, edges, and faces. So, how does something like our default cube, or any other basic shape for that matter, become me, or become my desk, my props, or this background behind me? Well, the first principle we're going to go over is something called extruding. And extruding is when you take a face or an edge, or sometimes even a point on an object, and you add to it. You add to it without creating a second mesh. It's a complicated process to explain through words, so let me just show you. All right, so we're going to start this with the standard of adding a cube. You go to Add, Mesh, Cube. There are other shapes, but cube is a good starting point. And now we have our cube. So this is our basic 3D object. We all know it's made of points, edges, and faces. And by going into edit mode, which either you can do through here or using the industry compatible, 1 is vertex mode, 2 is edge mode, 3 is face mode, you can start to select individual components. Now the extrude tool is a little difficult to explain, but it can be found right here or with the shortcut Control E. And what it allows you to do is if you grab this plus symbol and you pull up, you can see it's effectively added what looks like a second cube, but it's not a second cube. This is the same object, but we've added more faces to it. What that means is these edges here are linked to these faces and these faces. So if I pull this out, you can see it balloons out both sides of them. An important thing to know about the extrude tool in Blender is that it has two methods of working by default. Normal, up here, is where you will see just one yellow handle. This allows you to extrude along what's called a normal, which is the average of the direction of two faces. It can be very useful, especially for making diagonal shapes like this, but for the baseline stuff, you want to switch this to X, Y, Z. And now your extrude tool has 3 different handles representing the 3 different axes, X, Y, and Z. What this means is I can grab the Z here and pull out and create another what's called subdivision, that is element to the mesh. Or I can grab this side and pull it out on Y, and now we have more like a Tetris piece. The extrude tool is one of the primary tools that you're going to be using when 3D modeling. It's pretty much the lifeblood of your workflow. That having been said, it's useful for more than just extruding faces on a cube. Case in point, let me show you how with a plane, that is to say a flat square surface, you can make something that would be like the line around my eye. So for this, we're going to use a plane instead of a cube. This can be applied to any kind of mesh that you have, but for this, we're going to be using a plane. So instead of going to add mesh cube, we're going to add a plane, which really is just like one side of a cube. Now, if we want to extrude this in face mode, again, pressing 3 on the keyboard, I can just grab this face and pull up, and now we've made a cube. Sure, that works. But you can also do something such as switch to edge mode and grab this edge. And once you've done that, if you pull it out, you can see we've created a plane with 2 sections. And I'm going to keep pulling it out, but now I'm going to rotate it and I'm going to move it. And when I move it down, we're starting to make something that has a little bit of a curve to it. I'm also going to grab this, I'm going to rotate that a little bit, and maybe I'll rotate that one a little bit. And I can just keep extruding, and I can keep rotating, and I can keep moving things around. And suddenly, from that simple plane, we're starting to get a shape that could be used for, say, an eye loop. which is the ring of geometry that surrounds the eye on a 3D character model. So I'm going to keep extruding. I'm going to keep pulling it up. And we are very close. The shape is starting to come together. Now I can pull it out, rotate it, move it. And I can do the same here. And I'm just going to switch to point mode or vertex mode. Again, you can click up here or hit 1 on your keyboard. And now I can grab individual points and I can start to pull them closer together. Since this is all one continuous mesh, I don't need to go out of edit mode and into object mode to select different parts of it. I can just keep working on this piece of geometry. So here we've made something that is more complex than just a simple cube or a plane, and we did it with a plane. What you've just seen are the fundamentals of how 3D design is done. Everything starts with a primitive shape, such as a plane, a cube, a sphere, and so forth, and is then modified, extruded, and shaped to resemble something else. So you'll notice that I happen to leave the end of that little loop open. Typically for a shape like this, something that would have to move and flex, you'd want this to be one complete sealed ring. This is where something like the merge option comes into play. Merging is when you take 2 points or 2 edges and you join them together so they form one continuous surface. Let me show you. So once again, going back to our model, this is what I mean. Even if I were to take these and move them as close together as I can so that it looks like it is one continuous surface, it just isn't. Because if I grab this edge and I move it, it's detached. What you want to do is you want to go into vertex mode, and if I select one of these, hold down Shift and select the next one, I can then go to Mesh, Merge, and I'm going to choose at center. And that means that now instead of there being 2 points, there is only 1. So if I move this now, it moves both of these faces together. I'm going to do the same to this one, and I can either go to Mesh, Merge, at center. I can right click and do Merge Vertices at center. Or, if you're feeling really adventurous and you hit Tab on your keyboard, this becomes a search for every function in Blender. So I'm going to type in merge, and it gives me mesh, merge at last, first, collapse at center, so forth. I can select at center. Now, this edge is one edge, no longer 2, which means that this is one continuous loop of faces, or as it's actually called, a face loop. Now, the reason for doing this is because typically when you're doing a shape like this, you don't want to have any stray edges. You don't want to have anything that's not connected. Unless, of course, your edge is at the outside of a model. So in this case, by merging these vertices together, we've made it so that our entire mesh is no longer a strip, but it's a loop and is one continuous surface. This comes in handy for things like the next lesson, where we're going to learn about adding edges. So I have hidden my little loop here in my hierarchy, which you can do by checking and unchecking the little eye icon that hides and shows things. I've hidden that for now so I can show you what I mean by adding edges. So just like before, I'm going to add a plane. And I'm going to go into edge mode, 2 on my keyboard. So either you can add edges if you have a shape that is bigger than what you're doing by doing extrude and pulling it out. But let's say you wanted to add something that was roughly in the middle here so you could pull out these 2 bottom parts. Well, the first thing you would do is you would actually add edges. As long as your surface is continuous and as long as it has at most 4 sides, you can use a tool such as Loop Cut. And if you select Loop Cut, shows up with a yellow line on your mesh. I want to add one going top to bottom on my y-axis, or green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for that yellow line to show up. I'm going to click and hold down left mouse. And as long as I'm holding it down, you can see I can drag this edge anywhere that I want. So I want to put it down here. And what this has done is it hasn't changed the overall shape of my object. It has just created an extra edge inside this face. And this means that if I wanted, I can extrude a small face out of here. Or if I go to vertex mode, and I'm just going to move this up here, now I can extrude a larger side here, and we have a more irregular looking shape without having compromised the actual geometry of our object. Loop cuts are very useful for a multitude of reasons. One, they allow you to add more geometry to something without having to extrude more faces. But in another sense, let's take our loop, our face loop. Right now, I can only move the outside edge or the inside edge. And you can actually select a whole edge loop by just double clicking on one of the edges. As you can see here, click once, I only select this. Click twice, you've selected the whole loop. But what if I wanted to put a point in the middle of this? Well, I'm going to go back to my loop cut. And you can see now, because we merged the two vertices here, this loop goes all the way around in a circle. Once again, click and hold down, and I'll put it where I want. So let's say here. Now my loop is in, and I'm going to switch back to my move tool, W on the keyboard, or selecting the move tool up here. And I can pull it up. And now we already have a more complex shape. I can go back and I can add another one, and I can add another one. And you'll start to see that wherever there is an edge, that is where you create a crease. So just by adding two more edge loops and not moving the center one, I've created something that has one up, one down, one up, one down. The other advantage of having done this is that I did not have to extrude any more faces. I simply added faces by creating edges. Every time you create an edge, you are in fact creating a new set of faces. So whereas right here we have one face, if I put in my loop cut, now I have two faces. So I've split it in half. And loop cuts don't just have to be something that goes around a loop like this. You can add a loop cut as long as there is a continuous series of faces, or as we saw with a plane, even just one face. So for example, I don't like how this area is just so flat. Here and here, it's too flat. And let's say here too. So I'm going to take my loop cut, and I'm actually just going to click immediately so it puts it right in the middle of these. And you can see I'm already adding more faces. So now, if I go back to my move tool, and I double click this edge loop that has just been created, and I pull it out, suddenly I'm rounding off the shape a lot more. And I can actually pull that in like that. And this one, I'm just going to pull out a little bit like that. And this is actually how a 3D artist will take something that is a basic low poly geometry, low poly meaning not very many faces, and will refine it into something that is more high detail. So I'm going to just keep going like this, and you can see we're starting to get something that has a lot more definition to it. And I click here, and I pull out, and I pull up, and down, and down. There. So this object has a lot more faces to it now, and it was still just the loop that we created with our edge extrusion from earlier. By simply adding more edge loops to it, adding more edges to it, we were able to refine the shape to a point where it's something that can be more recognizable and something that has more detail. This is why edge loop cutting is so useful. You don't need to spend a lot of time generating your entire base mesh when you can get the absolute bare minimum of what it's supposed to look like and then refine it using edge cuts. So I think that's going to about do it for today. We've gone over things like extruding, merging, and adding edge loops. These are very, very important tools for your 3D modeling toolset and will take you a long way already. Next time, we're going to start by actually modeling a complex object such as a chair. We're going to see how the principles that we've already learned can be applied to making an actual representative object. So stay tuned for that and more tutorials from me. Once again, I'm Drake. I make things. This has been Drake Makes.